Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest conversation in our Gender Data series. Today, we'll be talking about how to use data to help support women entrepreneurs during COVID-19. I'm Kelly Rogers. I'm an associate editor for DevX, coming to you from Montana. And thanks to all of you for joining from wherever you are. So this is actually one in a 10-part series that DevX is hosting in partnership with Facebook, exploring how data can be used to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. And so already we've looked at the complexities of using data to inform gender-based violence responses, ensuring that women are better represented in COVID-19 response policymaking, and in better supporting women's mental health. And those are just a few of the pressing topics that we've looked at. You can find those on our Facebook page and also look out for our future online events. And also, please feel free to participate on social media using the hashtag #GenderData and the hashtag DevXEvent. But today we're talking about women entrepreneurs. So social distancing measures, disrupted supply chains, and decreasing global demand for certain goods have already disrupted women-led businesses around the world. And this only intensifies existing barriers that women-led businesses already face, such as lack of access to financial capital and a potentially limited access to social safety nets. The Ministry of Women and Human Rights Development of Somalia actually recently authored an opinion piece for DevX, and she mentioned speaking with women-led businesses in Mogadishu. And already the curfew there had really limited the number of hours that they were able to sell and hawk their goods, but also the closure of seaports and airports had meant that they weren't able to get their hands on the goods that they normally sell because those are imported, whether that was clothing or candies. And so a lot of women had lost their income. And as we know, a woman's loss of livelihood, loss of income, financial independence really has wide-ranging knock-on effects. And so how can we understand, where women business owners and how women business owners are vulnerable, and ensure that lending initiatives, social safety nets, and other programmatic support reaches them? And so these are some of the questions that we'll be examining today, along with the help of our brilliant panel of experts, who I will introduce you to in just a moment. Before we get started, a few notes on admin. So we plan to have this event last about an hour. The first half of the hour will be a moderated discussion between me and our panelists, after which we'll enjoy a brief presentation from one of our panelists on a specific survey. And after that, of course, we will have time for a Q&A. So as those questions pop into your head, please pop those into the chat box and note whether that question is to be directed to a specific panelist, and we'll be sure that that reaches the right person. Also, if you're having any technical difficulty, just note that in the chat box and a member of our team on the back end will be able to support you. And if you're a note taker like me, don't worry, because we will be sharing a copy of the slides as well as this presentation with you after the event. All right, now if we can hopefully have us joined on the screen by our panelists, I'll introduce them to you. So today we're joined by Pamela Bella Nyambutoka Katuru, who is the Africa Regional Director for the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction. We are also joined by J.W. Schneider, who is a research scientist at Facebook. We have with us as well Sri Lakshmi Papineni, an economist with the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, and Paula Gonzalez Martinez, who is a research analyst for the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab. So a warm welcome to all four of you. I'm really glad that you could join us today. So without further ado, Pamela, I want to start by going to you. I know that you work with micro-level village savings and credit groups to improve access to finance. And so I wonder if you can give us a sense of what you're seeing on the ground with the women that you work with, and what are the specific challenges that women entrepreneurs are facing right now as a result of COVID-19? Oh, Pamela, I do think you are still on mute. So if you want to tap that mute button so that we can hear you.
Sure.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly, and everybody here. Yes, as Kelly mentioned, work with the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction and work with several thousand rural women, specifically at the micro level. And it goes without saying, this has COVID-19 has really drastically affected them. We have seen them lose a lot of income, specifically in sales from their most of them have informal businesses, small businesses. Most of them couldn't continue with these businesses. There was very low demand. Transportation in many countries, there were lockdowns, so they couldn't even easily transport their goods and services. We have literally seen also a shift in how businesses are working. For example, they would want to adapt to new ways of doing business because the physical meetings are a problem because of social distancing, but then they don't have the capital, they don't have the resources to adapt to technology. So technology is also access to technology is a problem, access to finances. In most countries, the safety nets have not been there for at the micro level. So most of these, small businesses have been left to fend for themselves to do this. I've talked to some women and they have actually told me they've been what they would say, eating into their capital because they have nothing else to do. They're not seeing the income and they have no choice. So they have to use the capital that they would have used to reinvest and grow their businesses for household needs. Most of the women take care of household needs. When it comes to even health services, they've been also affected because transportation again is a challenge. With reduced income, and you have to get health services. They've also had a challenge in this area. When we talk about uh, girls and women, we even know there've been increased cases. I live in Uganda, and there's been increased cases of gender-based violence, and this is reflected in many places as well. Uh, and it's this in this period that they've seen a high percentage increase of gender-based violence in their homes. And this is directly linked to reduced incomes, at the household level. So a lot of these issues, the market demand, because purchasing power has reduced. So the markets have also, the demand for goods, as I said, especially even in the agriculture sector, which we already think, people have to eat. People have reduced on their food budgets because they don't have the, purchasing power. So all this at the end of the day impacts on this, rural farmer, this rural woman who is, whose only income is basically from this. Agriculture extension services, all these have, had an impact on specifically for micro level businesses and specifically for women. I will be adding on more, but these are really what is happening on the ground. Even with some measures that are being taken, still a lot still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. JW, I want to go to you now because I know that you've worked on the Future of Business survey for Facebook along with partners at the World Bank and OECD. Can you tell us more about the survey and how it's helped you and others better understand the challenges specific to women-led businesses, especially during the pandemic?
Sure, Kelly. So thanks for that. And thanks, Pamela, for setting up my answer here really nicely. So I'm going to touch on a lot of the same points, but really briefly, for those of you who don't know, the Future of Business survey is a semi-annual survey collaboration between Facebook, the World Bank, and the OECD. It is fielded in over 100 countries to small medium business leaders through the Facebook platform. The content is developed in collaboration with the World Bank and OECD, and the aggregated data sets are publicly available on the World Bank's web portal. So as for the specific challenges of women-led businesses, especially during the pandemic, there's a lot of places that we could touch on. I think there's a few we could confidently say we've seen very stark differences very consistently. And the research that we've done has absolutely shown a lot of the same issues that Pamela raised. Where we're seeing on the ground, we're also seeing it very starkly in the survey data. So one thing that's been a very consistent theme for us is inequality of access to capital by gender. So women-led small businesses struggle much more in the survey data with access to capital. They often have less access, and they often feel like they have fewer resources for attaining capital for their business, which is a huge problem globally, not just in the developing world, but also in the developing world. So the second thing we kind of notice is that the industries hardest hit by COVID specifically, as the World Bank's prior research has shown, are generally industries where we see disproportionately more women-led businesses. So where we are having more women entrepreneurs, we're seeing harder effects of the COVID crisis. These are industries like hotels, tourism, services. These are all industries where women have made greater gains over the last decades. And these are all industries that are being much harder hit by the pandemic, as opposed to industries where we see more businesses led by men, such as agriculture, forestry, fishing, things like that. It's also important to remember, though, that businesses are led by people. And this is another thing that I was, well, I wouldn't say happy, but this is a thing that Pamela raised, where she raised a very excellent point that household capital is not always separate from business capital, and people are getting their businesses going through savings. And we're finding that for businesses led by women, we tend to see among those women higher rates of reporting household struggles, either disproportionate burden of housework, which is a thing we've seen in the literature time and time again, but is something that we see continually and sharp differences on globally in our data. Women are disproportionately taking on this household burden in addition to their business responsibilities. So we're able to validate this among entrepreneurs even. We still see this really large imbalance. And we also see that, again, household capital, people are relying on their savings to restart their business or to keep their business going. So this is already taking a challenging circumstance and making it more challenging by putting pressure on the household. So overall, the suggestion that I've taken away from this is that both financial and social support are critical during this time, not either one alone. It's not enough to just cut businesses alone, and it's not enough to just offer support with childcare or housework. Both things are needed right now because businesses are led by people, and you have to take care of both the family and the business to keep things going. It is also very clear, and this is sort of more of a meta comment, it's important to disaggregate data by gender for research purposes. This is a thing that the literature has struggled with for a variety of reasons, and the research that we've done in this direction with the World Bank has done nothing but emphasize the need for gender disaggregated data. All of these differences would be hidden if we were unable to disaggregate the data. And then finally, geographic coverage is very important. So we've had a unique opportunity to look at a population that's otherwise difficult to survey in many locations. We are good at surveying more marginal businesses. We're good at surveying businesses that are less attached to the formal sector. And we are good at surveying businesses without a fixed physical location, which is a struggle in many other scenarios. And that unique geographic coverage has allowed us to draw insights on populations that are otherwise time-consuming, expensive, or difficult to survey. So I think that about covers it. So thank you.
Thanks, JW. Yeah, I want to get into, I think, a bit later some of the limitations of a digital tool, but I think that's great to note where those strengths are. And also, both you and Pamela now have mentioned that need for financial and social interventions and support. So Sri, I know the World Bank team probably hasn't been able to integrate the findings from this latest survey yet. I know that you've just gotten preliminary results, but I wonder if there are already sort of thoughts in your head about how you can use the data to broadly inform policy that could support women-led SMEs in the ways that JW and Pamela have already mentioned, and as we enter, this economic recovery phase.
I guess I should sort of, where I work, the Gender Innovation Lab, what we really do is impact evaluation research to find out kind of what programs work for women in sub-Saharan Africa. And so our bread and butter really is kind of data, and we, any evidence that we have is kind of backed by what we've been informed with evaluations. And so, in terms of the future of business, I think that's a really great. We've kind of repurposing. JW mentioned that we're doing this. We typically did it twice a year, but what happened with Facebook and OECD and ourselves at the World Bank, we just decided that to repurpose it and create a COVID study. And so, what I'm going to present on later is sort of the first wave of a 6-wave series of surveys. So the idea that it comes and it's going to inform what we do going forward is really important. I think what we've done so far at the World Bank is sort of focus on the emergency response, so around cash transfers. And we've used the impact evaluation literature or the research we've done there to kind of inform how to design cash transfers and sort of more of like, how do we immediately help households and firms? We're moving into the economic recovery phase, and I'll show you sort of some correlations with the quarantines and things like that. But the idea that businesses may be temporarily closed, but they're hoping to open at some point. What the idea of this data set at the moment is to kind of really get at the constraints that women are actually facing, and then inform policy that way. What constraints are we trying to address in what way? And so I think from now we're going to be able to use the data. I mean, we got the data on June the 2nd, so we've been hustling to get the results out. Then, but that's the whole point of this, is to kind of inform policy. I'll pass you over.
Thanks so much, Sri. Paula, I'll turn to you now and see, just from your perspective, what are some of the current data gaps when it comes to gender data linked to female entrepreneurs in particular? Considering that COVID has really limited face-to-face methods and maybe changed data collection methods in terms of what's possible, is now the time to kind of explore new methods that seek to improve the quality of data collection and analysis when it comes to understanding the needs of women-owned SMEs?
Yeah, so I think that in general, there is like a lot of lack of quality when it comes to measure women's entrepreneurship, but also comparability across countries and time. I think there's been some improvement. You can find the World Bank entrepreneurship surveys. You can find the LSMS team has been working, but it's country specific, right? And these surveys focus on ownership and management, but they don't really explore other type of factors that big data does, or like we are been trying to work on. Still, there is a lot of work to be done, but like we need data that explore factors that motivate how women engage in self-employment work, why they do it, if it's for needs or for opportunities, that inform the specific constraints of those type of business, right? So we don't really go into the nitty-gritty. So I think that there are like 3 areas related with women empowerment, or 3 dimensions, where big data could help a lot. One of them is earning disparities. So there is a lot of these surveys, they measure earnings, but the problem is that these data sources just come from like, they have on a specific coverage scope and a specific characteristics. So it's very difficult to compare, right? The other one is the informal employment, which GW sort of mentioned, but it's very important in the context of gender, because we have seen women own business that are usually smaller and like very new, right? A couple like entrepreneurs, and those businesses tend to be informal. So with big data, you can actually capture a lot of this business, and you can capture a lot of this information. And especially because a lot of these businesses are so seasonal or mobile. GW mentioned some of those things. So, but it applies a lot specifically to women. And the third one, which it goes a little bit on the lines of informal work, is unpaid work, which is related to domestic work. Sri is gonna show some differences, but here I think there are 2 things. One is like time use and how women are like actually focusing in a lot of taking care of dependence, but also women tend to have a lot of businesses that are childcare, and childcare are usually informal. I think that is very interesting, which we found in the last wave. We need to look more into that, but women actually closest business are spending, when these women owners, they're spending a lot of time preparing web page and taking online courses. So I think that shows already that there is an initiative for that, and that's why it would be like very interesting to look into big data. Now, when it comes to new methods to explore, I think that it doesn't mean that we just start to work with big data not that long ago. I mean, like since we started to collaborate with Facebook, we mostly do, as Sri said, household surveys. I think there must be a complementarity, right? So for example, we did with the Facebook data that we received in January, we included some gender norms, and we're exploring how those are constraints for women entrepreneurship, but we're using that together with like national representative data of the world values surveys and comparing like individual beliefs that they report with what it is reported in our representative data. So I think that like mixed methods, it's something that is already starting to do it, but it's like, it could be like a new thing that it could be more used. And maybe the other thing would be to just really create some international standardized measures. It is clearly important to focus on countries, but it's very difficult to see the progress and to track how women entrepreneurship are changing across the globe if there are not like some standardized measures. I think that would be it. Yeah.
Thanks, Paula. Speaking of big data, JW, let's get back to the question that Lee sort of mentioned earlier, which is what were some of the limitations, would you say, of a tool that's purely digital? Because we know, of course, that what many women-led businesses are not online, or maybe don't have access to internet. And also, I wonder if I could ask, how accessible are the results of this survey, and how does Facebook help ensure that the global community can leverage this information to benefit small businesses and increase economic opportunity in the work that they're doing?
Yeah, this is a great question, and a question I get a lot. If I had to guess, this is probably the main reason that I'm here on this panel to sort of speak to this topic. So I'll take through a couple of just the key advantages that Facebook is offering here as a survey platform, and then that'll help contrast with the limitations that we know and are always trying to understand better as we go. So basically, where Facebook has advantages are speed, cost, and coverage. So we have extremely high levels of adoption among the internet population. And then commensurately, we have difficulties with coverage in places where internet coverage is either less total, or where internet access is differential by population. For example, in many countries, we know that women and definitely women entrepreneurs have less access to the internet than men in some countries. That's a well understood phenomenon. So this does mean that we need to take an amount of consideration and weighting and sampling commensurate with this level of internet adoption. So the data do require additional work relative to a well-designed household panel survey for post-processing with weighting, basically. We, however, can turn a survey around very, very quickly because we can push it out on mobile phones, which is where Facebook surveys primarily are seen. This gives us a great opportunity to look at populations that are highly mobile, or populations that have businesses that are not attached to physical locations, because we get them on their phone. And as we know, phone adoption across the world is increasing every day and becoming less and less of a binding constraint on us. But it is still a constraint we have to deal with and a constraint we have to address. So additionally, being a primarily mobile platform, we must adapt our survey designs to the mode. This means that we're somewhat more limited in content than we can field in relatively similar household surveys. So a household survey can last 3 or 4 hours. A household survey can ask all kinds of questions across many, many modules. Facebook is best used when the surveys are purpose-built for specific research questions. And I think Paul and Sri are going to speak to this a little bit later, but that's it's been a successful model for us so far. So instead of trying to create sort of an omnibus survey that covers every single topic, the platform is more modeled toward addressing specific research questions, creating custom data sets for specific research inquiries. So of course, we can never replace household survey data, and we can never really replace even in some countries, live interview over phone surveys. What we can do is offer complementary data for specific research purposes and try to understand our limits, particularly as regards representativeness, as best we can. So we can provide additional perspectives and data that are otherwise difficult or expensive to collect. And I think that's a kind of a good overview of our key sort of benefits and limitations. And I hope that you can kind of understand the development of the Future Business Survey a little bit better after that explanation.
Thanks so much, JW. Yeah, that was definitely helpful. Paula, I wonder, just sort of popped into my mind, kind of listening to you and then listening to JW explain the survey a bit more and its strengths and limitations. Do you think that COVID has sort of pushed certain data collections, maybe accelerated them in some way, certain partnerships or certain methods? Like, will we see sort of a change going forward? I know this is not.
I mean, this is an example, right? Because we used to collect the future of business every 6 months, and now it's being an effort of doing it every month, which it's quite a lot, especially for GW. But because we need to adapt it, but it's very, very interesting, is because you can actually capture so much more. And I mean, I think across the world as well, like in even impact evaluations we have, it's not that we just want to measure COVID and everything, but it's something that is affecting so many like parts, and we kind of continue also doing household surveys. So we need to sort of develop more what it is, doing them online. People also may have more time to answer them online because they're connected more often than what they used to be. So COVID has definitely given a push to that, I would say.
All right, thank you, Paula. Pamela, I want to go to you now because I'm curious what sort of data that you rely on right now to inform efforts to improve social safety nets for rural women. And I'm curious whether you think there's sort of room for tools like the Future of Business Survey to help small NGOs that maybe lack in-house data capacity themselves to better understand the needs of the female entrepreneurs that they're trying to serve.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Currently, we are relying on data from, the governments, many UN agencies, even the World Bank. I mean, even the Future Business Surveys, we also look at that, So yes, we're already relying on that data, but also collecting our own in-house data, picking up stories from the field, because getting the voices of the affected people, directly from them is very key as well. So we are correlating all the various data that is out there to design gender appropriate strategies to deal or to work and improve the socioeconomic conditions of particularly the rural SMEs that we're working with.
And what sort of data do women entrepreneurs themselves need in order to create coping mechanisms or just understand maybe what services are available to them? Is that something that you also think about?
Yeah, right now, I think they need a lot of data on, for example, what are the forecasts? What's the outlook? I think there is a lot of data on what's happening now, but what does it mean in the future for them? So that forecast is not very clear. There's a lot of uncertainty for them in terms of what to expect or how to respond to the future needs, or what COVID does mean to them, or what it will mean to them 6 months down the road, 1 year down the road. How do I adapt? So the data on adaptation, especially for rural people, rural women, rural SMEs, is still not very clear. So that kind of data is very important. The other data that is really needed is on, in practical terms, how do they technologically advance? I mean, I like what JW said about, using Facebook, as a platform, because of the speed, the cost, the coverage. But again, also, how do we get the service providers to provide an enabling environment for this to work? Because as you've said, there's issues of network, there's issues of cost, there's issues of even just coverage, or even having the right gadgets. So I might want to start doing digital marketing, because that is what the context now defines that I do. But do I have the right tools to be able to do that? Do I even have the knowledge? Do I know what the marketplace is? So in terms of that digital knowledge or adaptability, they still need to provide that knowledge to people on the ground. We seem to have it, in maybe urban or peri-urban, but in the rural communities, it's still really a myth, So clear, practical adaptation of technology and digital ways to improve marketing, to adapt their needs, to adapt their businesses, is still something that we need to have more data on, and hopefully this will help them to improve their businesses. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Pamela. Sri and Paula, I want to go back to the two of you, just based on your previous paper. I believe it's called Tackling the Global Profitarchy, Gender and the Choice of Business Sector. And so that paper actually said that globally, the average male-owned firm in a male-dominated sector has slightly more than double the profits of a female-owned firm in a female-concentrated sector. And there are other findings like this in the paper. So how can data help inform and narrow that gap? What's sort of, where do we go from here, I guess?
I don't know if we have the answers, but
yeah. It's a simple final question, right?
Yeah. Well, so this is a paper that we did with Marcus Goldstein, which is the lead economist at the Gender Innovation Lab. We did it with the survey of a year ago. And yeah, as you said, basically the main finding, or the two main findings, is like female in male-dominated sectors make about like 60% higher wages than female in female concentrated sectors. We also found that there is like a profitarchy, which we call it that way, that is basically male are in the top, male in male-dominated sectors, then followed by female in male-dominated sectors, male in female concentrated sectors, and in the bottom, they're like the females. I think what it is important from this study, like clearly there is a lot of limitations. We cannot include a lot of variables that we want because it cannot be that long and everything. And we do some differentiation between developed and developing. But what is very, very interesting is like we found very commonly findings across the globe. We found that there is clearly sectoral segregation and a gender earning gap that it's across the globe. So we start to look with the information we have, who are these women? Who are these women that are crossing the sector? And there is a lot of common factors across the globe. So these women tend to be women that inherit the business, that they usually have, they're not that many difference in terms of age, but they, across the globe, one of the interesting findings is that they have a male role model growing up. So this would, for example, guide policies related with mentorship. It doesn't have to be exactly a role model that is male, but this is clearly saying there is like some sort of policies that would work maybe across the world. And another finding that it was clearly, we covered 97 countries, if I'm not wrong in that round. It was that spousal support, it's very important for women to cross over. Like, I don't think we want to make a point of, okay, women should cross over, if they want to stay in female concentrated sectors, but it is important to have that information, right? So maybe one of the programs is like, would you target young female that before deciding the career, and they just highlight what would be their earnings if they actually cross over. It's just more like give an option and information. And I think that with this paper, even if we didn't have like what you would have 2,000 questions of a household survey, we could like make clear like findings that would work across the globe.
And I think like what JW was saying about defining the research question. So, you know, we know that there's an earnings gap. Can we sort of, the question of occupational segregation comes up, like do women sort into specific sectors versus men? Why did they do that? And so we started with the research question to kind of, and what Paola was describing as the crossover, women who've entered male-dominated sectors. The characteristics of those women might give us some advice on what to, you know, what support programs that Paola was mentioning, you know, to either, you know, do we need to expose the earnings in various sectors? Do they need more information? What can we do to support them if they do enter those sectors? So the idea is to kind of get a picture of the globe. And there were some surprising findings, like education didn't matter of you crossing over, and like access to finance was one thing that didn't seem to matter, but there was a level of, you know, there was a male involvement through the role model side, through the spousal support that Paola was talking about. So it gives us some insight. You know, a lot of the research is based out of the US. You know, Claudia Golden has a lot of work in the US, and so taking that in a global level was really interesting.
All right, thank you both. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think actually it's time to transition to our slide presentation. So Sri, I want to invite you to share your presentation. And Sri is going to be sharing a little bit more about the future of business, which, as we mentioned, is a survey of small, medium businesses on Facebook around the world. And I know that the survey has evolved over time. So we'll be hearing about the findings from the latest from Sri. So over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm going to be presenting on some of the results of the latest wave. So as JW and the rest of the team have mentioned, that this is a repurposed study to look at the COVID impacts. And the wave that I'm going to be presenting on happened in the 28th of May to the 31st. So, you know, this is quite recent that this data has been collected. And when we say entrepreneurs, who we're talking about is basically those who are business page administrators on Facebook. So if you've ever kind of looked for a hairdresser online, you may have come across a business page where you see the business being advertised. So what we're talking about here is sort of those who administer those pages. And the data we're going to show is on about 26,000 business owners and managers in the survey, and around 50 countries have been surveyed with a good sample size here. And in this webinar, the focus is going to be on taking the gender lens to the impact of the COVID pandemic on entrepreneurs. So the first is a map, and what we have here is all the pink colors will tell you where exactly we surveyed for this round. And this is showing you the closure rate. So globally, from the wave, we see that 26% of the globe have temporarily closed because of COVID. And when we say closed, we've only looked at those from January the 1st to May the 31st when the survey happened. And then the majority of the closures all happened in March. So it's likely that these are through the lockdowns. And so if you look at all the correlations you see, I'm in the US. So if you look at the US, they've got a 20% closure rate currently, versus say European countries, which have an average of around 22% across European countries. And you know what's interesting actually on a regional level, if you look at South Asia, you look at Africa as in a whole, you'll see that the patterns are quite similar on a regional level. So one can expect that, you know, the quarantines and how COVID is kind of moving, it's having some impact on the closure rates. And so one thing that we're doing is sort of the y-axis will show you the business closure rate from the Future of Business survey that we just took. And below on the x-axis is the stringency index. And what that is, Oxford University basically has collected a lot of information on tracking the government responses to the pandemic, and they called it, it's all online, and the stringency index is basically 9 indicators put into an index to show how strong the quarantine and lockdown has been in place in a country. So, you know, closer to the left, you'll see Japan, which has a stringency index of about 30, so kind of more, potentially more eased policies, and their closure rate is 11%. And, you know, further to the right, you'll see Kenya, which is around a 90 stringency index, so stricter policies, and they have around a 40% closure rate. So the correlation is pretty evident from this graph, I think. And you'll see like the colors represent the different continents, and, you know, the maroon colors are sort of the European countries kind of bunched up together, but some outliers such as the UK and Ireland on the top that has that have quite strict quarantines, but also higher business rates relative to the others. You know, why we're here, we're talking about the gender gap. And so one thing that people have been really hungry for is you know, data at this moment. And we've had lots of speculation of what could be the reason for women closing more businesses, but this data set will show you that across the regions, we find that there is a gender gap in closure rates. And we do collect other information about revenues and employees, but in this presentation, I'm short on time, so I'm just going to show you the closure rates. And just the statistic, you know, what we find in globally is female-owned businesses were 5.9 percentage points more likely to close their business than male-owned businesses when we control for the region. So as you see across, the navy blue are men and the light blue are female, and that shows at the time of the survey how many of those businesses were closed. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through a bit about some of the reasons we've come up. You know, we've talked about sector, we've talked about time use and domestic responsibilities, and we also talked about access to finance. So we're going to use this data to try and get into what does this data show us about what women, you know, how women are differently constrained than men. And just to introduce sort of the stringency measure again, what we've done here is put the stringency index into quartiles from Q1 to Q4, where Q4 is the most strictest lockdown policies. And what you'll see is like the gender gap is highest where there are stricter quarantine or lockdown measures happening. In Q4 and Q3, there's a 10% gap versus Q1 where the gender gap is still there, but somewhat lower. So it seems like the quarantines and lockdowns are having more of an impact on women closing their business than men. So as I mentioned, sector was the first thing. So the graph on the right is showing you the sectors and their closure rates. So JW mentioned hotels, cafes and restaurants. Here you see that at the time of the survey, 32% globally had shut their businesses. Down to the end where you see the ICT sector where you've got 20% closure rates. What we find with the gap is that actually it's within the services where we see most of the differences between men and women. So men were more likely to be in professional services, and presumably that means that they can do more home-based work, versus women who are more likely to be in education and childcare services and personal grooming. So I'm assuming that's hairdressing. So the fact that within the sector, within services sectors, there are differences in what men and women go into is really, it narrows some of the gap when you control for these aspects. The second thing was the time spent on domestic tasks. What you'll see here in the graph is we asked the question, how much time in the last day did you spend on domestic tasks and family care activities? And this graph is showing you those who spend more than 6 hours per day on these particular tasks. And this is actually amongst the sample who are currently in operation. So what you see is that the blue is showing you, the navy blue for men is showing less. There are some men who are having to do more than 6 hours per day on some of these tasks, but the likelihood that women do is higher across all regions. There could be extra burden that coming from staying at home, or having, you know, with school closures in place, or if you have to take care of family members. And what we do find, you know, with the school closure policies, we find that women are more likely to close their business if a school closure policy is in place than men. And the access to finance, here what we ask the question currently, do you have a loan? And this is measuring if all the businesses that have a outstanding loan at the time of the survey. And what you'll see with the difference, although there's in some regions there aren't a gender gap, around 30% of women have access to a loan currently, and a slightly higher rate for men. And, you know, we don't have loan size, so access to finance, we just ask, do you have a loan or not? Of those people who say they have a loan, we have as many as 45% who say they would like a loan payment deferral policy would be needed at this time, given all the shutdown and the lockdown that's going on. And I wanted to highlight some of the other sort of, you know, access to finance. We talked about sort of getting like emergency response to individuals. I think this graph is quite telling about the regions. If you see South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in the middle, both men and women are having less access to any form of financial assistance in response to COVID versus some of the other regions of the world. The fact that, you know, if we're, you know, with the World Bank, we focus on those regions, but if we can mimic some of the other programming that has happened to support entrepreneurs elsewhere, maybe we can push this forward. And my last slide is basically asking men and women, what do you think are the most needed policies this time? You know, what this graph shows you, both men and women seem to have similar.
Sri, are you there?
I think you lost me for a minute, but
I did lose you for a minute,
Yeah.
but honestly, great timing to lose you for a minute because it was at the end of your presentation, right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Good job, internet.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Definitely a lot of great information there for our audience to digest, I think. And I thought that the results on the financial assistance in response to COVID-19 were particularly interesting and telling. But let's actually just move straight into Q&A. I know that we already have a lot of questions that have come in, so let's let me just take a look over here. Let's see here. So this is a question for Sri and potentially Paula. You're referring to the surveyed women as entrepreneurs. Are you placing both informal and formal activities in the same bucket, or is there a differentiated analysis?
So, as I said, we got the data on June the 2nd. So there are lots of different kind of heterogeneity we're going to be looking at, like urban and rural. If we can, you know, measure sort of informality, it's difficult because, you know, you don't really ask like, are you informal? Right? You know, there is a level that this data set, these are digitally women who have and men who have digital access. Okay. So there is a level of, you know, there is some indication, like, you know, those who want tax deferral versus across regions and things like that. But the idea that we can get at informality with this questionnaire or this data set is quite tricky for us. You know, I think we have, you know, what JW was talking about, the limitations, that's one thing we have to say, like, you know, this is the pattern that we're seeing at the moment amongst women and men who have access to digital tools. So there is a level of, we are complementing this with what we're doing elsewhere at the bank with business pulse surveys, and I think Paola mentioned the LSMS. So what is interesting is the results from this in terms of closures and effects on sales and things, very similar to some of the first surveys coming out from the business pulse survey done elsewhere. But yeah, we understand our limitations in kind of talking too much about formality versus informality at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Pamela, I wonder if I could get your take on this. So as COVID-19 will be around for an unknown period of time, and considering that most of the small businesses run by women thrive on human contact, what is the data and research telling you about the immediate effects on these businesses, but also in the long term? And I actually wondered if I could start with you, because I imagine that you have a good sense of this. You were describing women eating into their capital. So you probably have a good sense just from your own kind of qualitative analysis and anecdotes, what this might look like for the women that you work with.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. This is something we have discussed with the women and said COVID-19 doesn't look like it's about to go. And so it's about time that we adapt to what it means for the businesses. And one of the strong drives that we are driving is on digitization of especially businesses, because they don't necessarily need a physical contact, but also innovating around marketing, of services. So how do we, innovatively market without necessarily having to, put ourselves at risk? Other areas is we also looking at how they can mobilize resources, rural mobilization of resources, but also linking them to financial institutions that could help them access these finances, because again, we've talked about, the capital being used for other unintended uses. So access to finance and safety nets. So those are some of the things that we're saying, could we look into that? So linkages are very key, adaptation and innovating around the businesses.
Thanks, Pamela. A question for Paula. There are gaps in the data on rural women farmers and producers, especially those who have businesses based on agriculture products. Is this something that you are also looking at?
We are looking into sectoral, how is the difference, and we will try to do it geographically. I don't remember, JW, you can recall, but I don't think we did include rural and urban. But if we did, we will focus on that next. We did. I can't remember if we excluded it or not. We haven't get into that part. As Sri mentioned, we got the data not that long ago. In agriculture, we already find gaps. It actually is one of the sectors that's not being affected as much. It's going to be a bit difficult to differentiate if those are small farmers or not. Because we will know if they're rural or not rural, and if they are in the agricultural sector or not. But we will definitely look into that.
Okay, thank you. JW, as you mentioned, access to and use of mobile phones and online platforms like Facebook are uneven, and these gender and social inclusion issues will impact data results, as well as the context of respondents. How do you go about addressing this divide?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and I could legitimately talk about this for a couple hours. So I'll try to keep my response a little brief, but understand that I'm kind of like purposefully glossing over some of the details here. So the very short answer here is that we weight our data very carefully to make sure that we are representative of the base population that we are trying to make statements about. Now, because we can't fundamentally just get people online immediately, this is a long-term process and something that Facebook is always working toward as a company. We are constantly aware that this gap does exist, and we try to make sure that our research is contextualized properly to account for this gap, not necessarily to say that we have closed the gap, but to acknowledge that there are certain statements in certain populations that we did not reach with our data. This is why we have household surveys. Conversely, we're able to make more statements about households that are otherwise difficult to contact with household surveys, but do have mobile phone access. And so we do try to understand that this comes with both good and bad trade-offs for us as researchers. And we try to acknowledge these trade-offs and address them as best we can with statistics, survey weighting, and proper sampling.
Thanks, JW. And Sri, we've had a couple of questions come in because I know your presentation got a little cut off, and I think people were really interested in hearing about some of those policy implications. So I know on the last slide you were mentioning tax deferral, rent deferral, and such solutions. So could you sort of finish that last portion of your presentation for us?
Well, all I was saying on the last thing is actually what the respondents were saying that they needed at the time. And both men and women have sort of similar responses in what they need in terms of loan payment deferral, tax deferral. A similar percentage say that they need these kind of schemes. In terms of a broader question about policy and, the whole point of this survey is really to, first of all, kind of diagnose the problem. So the wave one is really to say, there is a gender gap. We found that in the data. So what can we do from here? I mean, a lot of our impact evaluation research so far has sort of looked at the cash transfers response. So as I was saying before, the emergency response to the crisis. Here we're talking about economic recovery. And if we know that there are constraints that women face, if it's a school closure policy in place in your country, what does that mean for, giving women loans that need to be repaid in a month might not be sufficient. Do you have to change the terms of the loan? Do you have to think about being flexible depending on the sector? A lot of this is kind of getting policymakers to see that, first of all, we've diagnosed that there is a gap. We're getting to the point where we're seeing there are some specific constraints that women have versus men. Policies are really needed. Financial assistance is really needed across for most business owners at the moment, but how can we tailor it better in this environment? So that's where we're starting with, whether we have all the ideas of what can be done. I mean, what we do with our research at the Gender Innovation Lab is test out policies, and we've got sort of the socio-emotional skills that have been useful for women entrepreneurs. So maybe that can be repurposed for like COVID resilience. So some of these sort of ideas have come from what we already know what works for women, but we're trying to kind of see how can we respond to COVID in a more direct way.
And Sri, just to piggyback on that, several people have been asking how you're planning to share the survey results with policymakers to help advocate for the support of women business owners. So I wonder if you could mention where this data will be available.
So maybe JW can add where we're going to actually put the data, but currently what the plan is on July the 8th, where Facebook and OECD and ourselves are going to release a global report to show, to summarize all the results we found within the survey. I mean, it is a global report, so the nuances in terms of gender is not as strong, but, our goal now is to get this data used, and, as a benefit, we're at the World Bank, and so we have a lot of kind of people looking to do policy within our institution, but getting the results out are how we normally do when we do research uptake is try and spread it far and wide to donors as well as NGO partners that we have. And I mean, JW, maybe want to add for Facebook side or elsewhere.
Yeah, so as with prior waves, we are planning to make country level aggregates of the survey data publicly available through the World Bank's data portal. And I think it does pop up in a couple other places, but it's definitely the World Bank's data portal. If you look in the Q&A, I've linked it a few times to people's answers. I will ask everyone to please be patient with us. This is a monthly survey. It is a very, very heavy lift to get it. So please forgive us if it does seem to be lagging a little bit behind even reporting. So I apologize in advance for that, but they will be uploaded in the coming weeks. Yes.
All right, thanks so much. We have a question on measuring social capital. So in addition to data on economic capital investments, does the survey also measure access to social capital? social capital has been and remains critical in-kind resource for women entrepreneurs. So I wonder if that's a question for Sri or Paula.
With social capital, what do you think what is the specific thing that we're looking for?
I would imagine.
I was going to say, is it how women are kind of being resilient to the crisis?
Yeah, sort of aside from those kind of like hard inputs, other sort of social services that could provide them relief at this time.
Oh, okay, so we're economists, so we tend to focus on that side. Something that we've tried to put in this next round is a measure of generalized self-efficacy. So as one of the outcomes for more of the social side in terms of sort of policies and social capital. We're limited in the sense that what we can give as advice now is limited by the fact that quarantines are in place and lockdowns in place. Like, we're not going to tell people to go and meet with others. A lot of the what Paula was saying, that women are tending to kind of go online and get support through digital trainings and things like that. But in terms of the Gender Innovation Lab, we've done in Nigeria, we're trying to do a study where we give those social and emotional skills I was talking about, give them training over the phone over a longer period, such that when they start their economic activities, they've built sort of an action plan and gotten some of those kind of resilience in place for when we kind of start up again. We are kind of restricted on that side of things at the moment because of the quarantines.
Well, many thanks for that, Sri. And it does look like we're running short on time. Actually, this has gone really fast. I'd just like to give a big thank you to Sri, Pamela, Paula, and JW, and of course to our international audience for joining us today. I think today's conversation has offered really practical insight on how women-led SMEs have been impacted by COVID, but also hopefully some ideas on how to collect and use data to support women entrepreneurs moving forward. And hopefully how you can apply some of these things to your own work. So look out for the results of the Facebook Future of Business COVID-19 Wave 1 survey that's presented. It sounds like that will be launched on July 8th. And make sure to sign up for the other events in this Gender Data series as well, if this interested you. The series is on mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls using data. And next week, we'll be looking more deeply at using data to ensure access to maternal and reproductive health. So in the meantime, we'll be sure to share a recording of this online event as well as the slides with you. And thanks again for your time today. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.